What we're going to cover today, we're going to go over some safety and health management, outline some key elements that we need to have in a safety and health management system. We're going to talk about analyzing the workplace. We're going to get into what a baseline hazard analysis is. We'll get into some ongoing analysis processes, the industrial hygiene approach, okay, and I'm going to really lean heavily on my buddy Dave. But we're going to spend a lot of time in the middle of the day talking about what a written program needs to have in it, okay? We'll get into some ongoing strategies, and at the end of the session after the break, we'll talk a little bit about some specific hazards. The history behind this class is, I've been running the VPP program since 1996, and one of the things that we saw early on, in fact, our first 2 or 3 VPP audits, we went and found out they had a good, strong safety program, but their industrial hygiene program was kind of non-existent. And it was really bothersome. And I worked with Dave and a number of our other consultants, and we actually came up with a single page that's on our web page, but it's also in your handouts, and I'm going to want to say about page 34 is a industrial hygiene assessment for a VPP site. And we put this on the web page with the concept that if you can answer these questions, your IH program is probably good enough that you're ready for a VPP team to come in. If you can't answer these questions, you don't want us showing up yet, okay? Because it gets really, really uncomfortable if you don't know some of these basic industrial hygiene answers. So that's kind of the reason why we put this class together, was to try to help people better understand what it is that Oregon OSHA is talking about when we say you need to have a written industrial hygiene program, because that's not something that the code requires. The only place in the Oregon OSHA code that it says anything about a written industrial hygiene program is in the VPP language. It doesn't talk about it in SHARP, although the SHARP consultants are kind of guiding you that way, right? But nowhere else is it mandated that you have a written industrial hygiene program. So what that's saying is that this is a best practice, okay? Because if we think about what is compliance, the minimum acceptable standards, right? What was the minimum acceptable grade you could get in high school and still pass? It was a D- where I went to school, okay? That's the minimum acceptable standard, okay? If you want to aim at a D-, you're probably in the wrong room. But the SHARP or the written industrial hygiene program as a best practice is significantly above and beyond compliance. So I talk about safety and health management system as a system of managing systems, and people say, what the heck do you mean by that? Well, it's a system that allows us to methodically use a structured approach to manage these systems, doctrines, policies, procedures, all of this stuff that we have in place to manage our written programs, okay? To manage how we do safety and health. Within your system, you're going to have some major elements and some components that are in every single system, no matter what they look like, okay? You're going to have a system of management leadership. You're going to have a system that allows employees to be meaningfully and actively involved. You're going to have a system that allows you to analyze the workplace to determine what are the hazards that we have associated with the work that we do. Once we know that, we need to do something about those hazards. We've got to have a system that allows us to control or eliminate them. And finally, a system of training that keeps everybody up on the speed, okay?
It works better if you don't turn it off.
Oh, hey, guess what? This will be fun now. So I talked about some components, okay? And there's 3 major components that are going to be in every safety and health management system out there. Whether they're lousy or whether they're great, these components are still going to be there. What makes it lousy or makes it great is how well these components work together. Okay, so the first component we're going to talk about is the operational piece, and that's out where we do the work. Shop floor, out in the field, wherever it is that we're actually doing something, that's operations, okay? It's about finding hazards, it's about fixing hazards where we do the work. Okay, the next component is the managerial piece. The stuff we traditionally think of as management's duties. Setting policies, putting procedures down, staffing people, bringing in folks to do stuff, guiding the work, supervision, those kinds of things. Okay? And the third piece is the cultural piece. How we actually do the work up here following the programs, policies, and procedures, okay? So all of these things, again, are connected. None of them is really more important than any of the others. They are all interrelated, and together they make up our system. And how well they communicate with each other makes our system good or our system not so good, okay? One of the things that a lot of people didn't know is that every single OSHA mandated program that is out there was written with this operational, managerial, and cultural piece in mind. It's built into all the rules, okay? So your safety system then is going to be a lot bigger than just 1 + 1 + 1. It's way bigger than that, okay? So we look at those 3 operational pieces, again, finding and fixing hazards, managing the work and the way we do it, and we think back to those 7 elements that we talked about. Well, how did they fit into that? Well, if you look at finding and fixing, that's really about anticipating and detecting hazards and about fixing hazards, okay? And now analyzing it and fixing the hazard. The managing piece is about planning, evaluation, administration, supervision, training, making sure everybody knows how we're trying to get it done. And the final piece, the cultural piece, how we actually do it, is our management leadership piece and our employee involvement piece, okay? And a lot of people will look at this slide and say, wait a minute, management leadership, that belongs up here in the red, right? Why is management leadership more cultural than managerial? This is the part where you guys answer.
Behavioral.
It's behavioral. It's leading by example. If the manager never goes out of his office, what is he telling everybody that works there, right? If the manager walks through the plant with his safety glasses on top of his head, what is he telling everybody that he walks past? It's not important, right? If the manager puts on his hard hat and his safety glasses every time he walks out onto the shop floor, what is he saying to everybody that works there? This is important, right? So management leadership is vital to our cultural component. So the SHARP process was really built on the same concepts, okay? It starts off with a system of management leadership, okay? Management leadership by itself won't get us there. We gotta have our people involved, okay? Meaningfully and actively, and together we plan the work, evaluate the work, make sure we're doing what we need to do. We have to have a system of administration and supervision, ensure the work gets done, a system of hazard anticipation and detection to make sure we're finding the hazards, a system that allows us to fix the hazards, and finally a system of training, okay? Very interrelated, but if you look at your own workplace, you're probably gonna see all of these elements within what you do, okay? And so the SHARP process and the VPP process allows us to look at more detail individually with each one of these things, okay? So this is a poster that we've had out in Oregon OSHA for several years. A lot of companies have borrowed it and they take our logo off, put their own logo on it, but it shows you the VPP major 4 elements and all the parts and pieces. And people say, wait a minute, VPP there's only 4. SHARP there's 7, what happened? Well, if you look at it, management leadership is there, right? Employee involvement is there. The next one talks about planning with goals and objectives. It's there. The next one talks about resources and leadership. Yep, it's still there. The next one talks about worksite analysis. Yeah, it's there. Hazard prevention controls there. Training's there. So the 7 elements are still there. They're just in a slightly different feel. We'll put it that way. Okay, so what then does industrial hygiene have to do with all this? We cannot manage safety and health without the health part, right? It's been described as a science or an art of anticipating, recognizing, evaluating, and controlling those workplace conditions in the workplace that could cause somebody to get hurt, sick, or dead. And that is what our job is. Every one of us here as a safety person, our job is to prevent people back at work from getting hurt, sick, or dead, right? That's what we're here to do, to come up with some ideas that we can take back to work that's going to get somebody not getting hurt, sick, or dead at work, period, okay? So the industrial hygiene program, okay, is a cog in the VPP language. It really needs to be there. Now, if you're not VPP, I want you to think outside the box. The industrial hygiene program is vital to helping you manage safety and health. Okay? How does it do that? Well, it's connected to everything we do in worksite analysis. We cannot do an effective job of analyzing our workplace without the science of industrial hygiene. Okay? And I say it's a science and an art because I've got to work with some folks like Dave over the years, and they, you know what? They blow me away with some of the stuff that they're able to do. And we'll share some of that stuff as we go through. But if you think about it, safety hazards tend to be what?
Physical.
Kind of concrete. They're there. You can see them. Health hazards, not so much, right? You may not be able to see them. Maybe you can't even smell them, or maybe you can smell them for a sniff or two and then your olfactory nerves are burned out.
Apparitions.
Ghost-like, right?
Yeah.
Very hard to see. So we have to almost sleuth them out, okay? And so it is a science. We have to have a very scientific approach to determining what these hazards are or not. And then as you do it a little while, you get good at it and it becomes an art form. And a good industrial hygienist is worth its weight in gold. Okay, and we'll get more into that. But the IH program is also very much dictating how we control a lot of these hazards that we find. Okay, and without the industrial hygienist or somebody in that field to help us out, we will miss things. We do miss things, and I've seen it over my career time and time again. Okay, so even though an industrial hygiene program is not quote unquote code required, okay, common sense says you need to have one. If you really want to manage safety and health, you need to be thinking about industrial hygiene. Okay, so where can we get industrial hygiene help? From an industrial hygiene. Textbook answer, right? How many of you have a thing called workers' comp insurance? Guess what? They will provide you with industrial hygiene help if you ask them. If you don't ask them, many of them will not offer it. But you're already paying for it, okay? There's another thing that you're already paying for. Every dollar that you spend in workers' comp costs, a little bit of it goes to Oregon OSHA, and we are able to provide industrial hygienists through our consultative program, and they will come out and help you at no cost, okay? You're already paying for it, but there's no additional cost. So then there are a number of folks in this state who are private industrial hygienists who you can hire. How many of you have access to a corporate industrial hygienist? Okay, kind of handy thing to have. Bring them around a few times, they can see things that maybe you didn't see. So what's the difference? Yes?
Mark, you skipped one spot there that need clarification. Are the industrial hygienists that you send out or that we can use, they're on the consultation side?
They're on the consultation side.
Compliance side.
No, the compliance, you don't get to ask for compliance. They just kind of show up and make your day for you.
I know, they make me all
The Oregon OSHA has about 15-ish, I'm going to say, maybe a hair less, who are industrial hygienists by trade, who work for the consultative side of the house, who you can call and say, I'd like to have an industrial hygienist come out. You can ask for a comprehensive, meaning look at everything, or specific, just come and look at this or look at that. Okay?
There's a misconception as far as what side of the fence
Right, no.
they're working on.
I work for the consultative side of the house, and while the enforcement side of the house is vital, when I'm offering out services, it's coming from the consultative side of the house. You can't ask an enforcement officer, well, you can, but you might not want to. You can ask them to come out, but their job really is to come out after something or if you show up on their list.
But you don't share notes.
No, they have no access to what we do. We have access to what they do. But
Mark, just to expand on that, you can still call the compliance side of the house if you have a question.
yes.
And
yes.
I do that frequently. I'll
Yes.
call up OSHA.
Yeah.
I'll have a question about the lead standard.
Right.
And whoever's available
We'll answer the
will
question.
answer the
Yeah.
question.
Absolutely. And they're very good at that.
Out.
Yeah.
Coming out, if a compliancer comes out and they see a hazard and they've got employer knowledge of the hazard, employee exposure to the hazard, and it's code-related hazard, they don't have a whole lot of choice. They're supposed to issue you a citation. Yeah. Okay? So, what's the difference between health stuff and safety stuff. And we kind of talked a little bit about it, right? The safety stuff tends to be more physical, right? It causes bang, and ooh, that hurt. I got, we know when it happens. Tends to be related to physical things, right? Equipment, tools, ladders, machinery, those types of things. The industrial hygiene stuff tends to cause illnesses as opposed to injury. It can be acute, but more often it's chronic. Okay, what's the difference between acute and chronic?
Happens all at once, or it's over a period of time?
Over a period of time, exactly. And that is the key, over the period of time. The thing to remember, if you come out of here with nothing else, the thing to remember is that a workplace injury is going to bang, you're hurt, you know it. And a workplace illness is going to make you just as sick or just as dead, but it's going to take a lot longer to do it. And not only do you get to suffer, your family gets to suffer with you. Okay, big difference. And it drags out for a long, long, long time. Okay, some people get mesothelioma. Okay, you don't die of that quickly. It's long, it's ugly, and your family gets to suffer with you. So those are the things to remember, okay? They tend to be related to chemical exposures, okay? To bacterial exposures, to ergonomic type of exposures, noise, radiation, confined spaces. Now, a lot of us feel that an ergonomic hazard is a safety and a health hazard, and I really firmly believe that. But what I'm saying here is if you are going to have a written industrial hygiene program and you don't have an ergonomic program somewhere else, put it in your written program, put it in your written IH program. If you already have one, connect the two, okay? All right, so work site analysis. This is the key that we need to do. We need to understand what kind of hazards our people are exposed to when they're doing a job, okay? It begins with a thorough understanding of those things, of those hazards and potentially hazards that our people could be exposed to, right? Everything that we do at work needs to be reviewed. What kind of hazards are associated with that job, okay? It's more than just a baseline hazard analysis, but it's got to start somewhere, right? So it starts with our baseline. Okay, these are the hazards that are associated with this type of industry, this type of work. Okay, with safety hazards, health hazards, ergo hazards. But then we're going to go on a little deeper and we're going to start looking at more of the routine stuff. We've got job hazard analysis, job safety analysis, phase hazard analysis. So we're looking at what are the hazards that we're exposed to as we're doing our work on a daily basis, okay? What about significant changes? What about, like Tillamook is putting in a whole new center out here, okay? Do you think they just, let's make this happen? Or did they put some thought into that? How is this change going to affect upstream and downstream? Okay, and you guys use some kind of a management of change process to help keep you on track so that you're not getting off track, okay? Pre-use analysis. So how many of us have had the situation where one of the millwrights is using something at home and says, hey, this stuff is really good, and they bring it into work, right? So a pre-use analysis would be, well, we got to talk about that before we just bring it into work. We've got to make sure that this is really what we want it to do, or is it introducing something that we don't want here, right? So a pre-use analysis. And then documentation and use of these things. And this is where the industrial hygiene program can really, really help you, because it causes you to document this stuff. And once we've got it documented, now we can start using it. We identify it to the task. Okay, now we can start using it in training. We can start using it in our JHAs and JSAs. We can start making use of that stuff. And we update it continually. We'll get more into that. Routine self-inspections. How many of us are doing those? Safety committee is required to do a routine self-inspection. How often? Quarter. How often is management required to do one? Monthly, unless you're in construction, and then it's every week, right? Okay. Hazard reporting. Employees need multiple avenues to report hazards, and at least one of those avenues has to be anonymous, okay? Email is not anonymous. We see a lot of companies will be using like suggestion boxes and those types of things, but some way has to be anonymous. Now, we talk about the industrial hygiene program, and again, this is a VPP requirement. It's about sampling, about monitoring, about controlling the health hazards associated with the job. This is the key. This is why we're here today, to find out how our industrial hygiene program is going to make our safety and health management system stronger. Do we need to investigate accidents? Absolutely. Do we need to investigate near misses? Okay, not according to the code. Okay, is it a best practice? Absolutely. Absolutely. The more near misses we investigate, the less accidents we're going to have. It's been proven over and over and over again. And finally, trend analysis. So you're looking at those accidents and incidents and those hazards that you've identified, and you're looking for trends. Are we seeing a lot more of this stuff on this shift or on that shift or in this area or that area? And by that trend analysis, now we're able to bring our guns to bear where the problems truly lie, right? Okay, so all of us have basically 3 opportunities, but multiple ways to identify hazards in our workplace. We can do it before we start working, prior to exposure, okay? Or we can do it during exposure or after exposure, okay? And there's a lot of different tools available, okay? And Dave, you're gonna need to grab this and help me out here shortly. Prior to exposure, there's just a lot of, I'm gonna be talking about these and I will need your help. I do. Right back here. Okay, so our baseline we've already talked about, right? Significant change analysis, management of change. We talked about safety by design, building things in, having our people involved, open door policies, safety, health, and ergonomic project reviews. How many of you use some kind of a pre-use analysis? Best tool that's out there. The absolute best tool that's out there, and there's a bunch of them out there. PTP.
Pre-task planning.
Pre-task planning. So this is a process that says, okay, we are a work group and we're going to take on this task. Before we do it, we're going to talk about what it is we're going to do. We're going to talk about what kind of hazards we might encounter as we're doing it, what kind of hazards might be developed as we're doing it, and how can we, as a group, do this as safe as we possibly can. So we spend an extra 5 or 10 minutes beforehand planning the job, and we're able to do it a lot safer. Okay, STOP program.
Safety Training and Observation Program.
Start.
Safe Task Analysis Recognition Training.
My favorite one is C.
Stop. Evaluate. Eliminate.
And the poster for this one on one of our VPP plants, the great big sign says, don't just do something, stand there and see. Stop, evaluate, eliminate. I think that's a great way of doing it. SAFER is something that Roseburg uses, and it stands for?
See the risk, assess the situation, formulate a plan, execute the plan, record and report.
Okay. And then there's SOBER is one that Weyerhaeuser uses.
I'm not into this one anymore. Safety, observation, behavior, evaluation, and reaction.
And Trina's favorite is RED.
Recognize, eliminate, discuss.
Right. And so all of these things are something that we do as a work group or a work unit. It's not a big, involves everybody, just the folks that are doing that task. And before we do the task, we talk about it, we think about it, we plan for it. After we've done one of those, what's the chances of us coming in to do that job with a ladder that's too short? No, we're going to have the right tools because we've talked about it, we've planned it, we've formulated it, and we're going to go out and do it. Machine and task assessments, work permits process. A work permit is another tool that I think is vastly underused. How many of you use a work permit process? Great tool. It again causes us to think about what we're going to be doing, how we're going to be doing it, and what are we going to need to in order to do it right, okay? A really good tool. And then last minute safety checks, pre-job inspections, take 10, take 2, you know, those types of things are all about stop, look at what we're doing, think about, talk about, and then do it, okay? We can plan it. We can do some really incredibly scary things if we take the time, think about it, do it the right way, okay? Hazmapping. How many of you have ever heard of hazmapping? Okay, it's a really cool tool. The address for it is up here. It's an internet web page. You go in and you can search by chemical, you can research by disease, by jobs, by non-occupational activities. Virtually anything you want to do, you type it in there. It's a huge database online that allows you to start to look at what are the hazards associated with this job or this chemical or this industry, and it gives you a good way of pre-job planning because there's no exposure yet. You're still looking at things that you might have, okay? During exposure, we've got another ton of ways of helping us to analyze, okay? Baseline, our ongoing hazards, routine stuff, the phase hazard analysis, JSAs, walkthrough inspections, equipment inspections, our IH surveys, perception surveys, behavior-based safety observations. All of these are tools that we can use to identify hazards as the work is actually going on, as the exposures are actually happening, okay? And then our last line of defense is afterwards, okay? Cows are out of the barn, now we got to figure out what went wrong, right? We do that through some kind of an accident or an incident investigation process. How many of you have a written accident investigation process at work? Outstanding. It's required if you want to be at this level, right? Root cause, after action reviews, bunch of different audits, a bunch of different trend analysis. There are myriad ways of doing these things that are out there, okay? So, the industrial hygiene process is also very much into hazard analysis, and the baseline is where we start, okay? What are the hazards associated with what we do? Okay, so we establish some what we're going to call initial exposure levels. What's going to be acceptable here? Okay, and who's the one who's responsible to establish those? You guys, okay? OSHA compliance will come in and say if you didn't do it wrong, they'll give you a learning opportunity. But it's up to you guys, and then you guys determine if further sampling is needed. So what will trigger that? What would make you think I need to do more sampling? Maybe if your initial sampling is like really close to the permissible exposure limits, you want to pay attention to that one, right? So the baseline survey, we're going in, we're identifying hazards, right? Then we're developing or we're updating controls to make that hazard. Yes, Don?
Well, you're not going to really be able to determine if you're near the threshold if you don't know how to do the sampling.
Right, and
and so you're typically, if you're going to rely on what's going on with the activity, it's going to be more symptomatic.
That's true, but there's some tools that we're going to be sharing that can help. Shauna.
Like for an example of that, so like we had, I felt there was like working fluids in the air, so we had SAFE, my working comp carrier, they came out, the people were the testing biases, they came in and we were right at PEL, like an area.
Right.
So we changed some things in our coolant so there'd be less bubbles, make
right.
in the air. And then we had OSHA, because it was quicker than the 2-week processing for SAFE, came out with their handheld device and then just did another sampling
to see how much better you had made it.
We only had it in one machine versus 3 others, and he could compare, and then now we could tell a difference. So once we replace the coolant and the other 3, we'll have SAFE back out to do some
sampling again, right?
So
right.
Shauna, how did you determine without the sampling you were close to the PEL?
I wouldn't have known without the sampling that I was close to the PEL. I just knew that it was an irritant, and years ago
right.
I did like an air sampling just for like carcinogens or what's in the air, because you could always see like a haze.
Right, so there's some sort of physical.
There was something that was.
Appearance, yeah, some smell.
They still had like allergic reactions. So after this class, I learned that you could get specific in your air sampling, and so then I went straight to metalworking fluid.
Yeah.
Right. And you're seeing improvements. And that's kind of the beauty of it. You fix, you update what it looks like, but then you're going to come back and check. Is it still doing what we want it to? Has it lowered that hazard level enough that we're okay with it, or not yet? I want to continue to sample. I want to continue to monitor this and know where I'm at. So it's an ongoing, never stopping process. If you think industrial hygiene is one and done, you're sadly mistaken. It does not stop, okay? All of these different tools that we use keep our knowledge updated, keep our understanding updated, but we always got to come back and ask, are these controls working like we thought they would work? If not, why not? What do we need to do to make it work? And then also, sometimes our what we think might be a fix is actually introducing something else downstream or moving a hazard upstream or downstream. And so we need to be cognizant of those types of things, okay? So it all starts with asking yourself, okay, what are some of the hazards our people are exposed to? Okay, are we exposed to noise? What's a good rule of thumb to determine whether or not it's too loud?
Can't hear the person talking.
Can't hear a person talking. If you're this far away and you got to shout, there's probably a noise issue. Okay? So that's a cue. Okay, maybe I need to have somebody come in and sample this. How about chemicals? How many of you use chemicals at work? Okay? Kind of so there's these little things that used to be called MSDSs that are now called SDSs, safety data sheets. Guess what? There's a wealth of information on those things. Okay? And what does anybody mix chemicals? Something you want to look at. Okay, what happens when this and this meet? Okay, what are the byproducts? Maybe we're doing some welding and we're putting a bead of weld down, but what's happening in the air around that? We got stuff circulating, right? Does anybody have repetitive stress at work? Okay, what about extreme temperatures? You guys get to deal with that, right? Biological hazards. Anybody have combustible dust at work? Okay, those are things to be thinking about. How about radiation? What are some other hazards that you guys have that aren't up here? Nothing? Well, okay.
A lot of ours are ergonomic issues
A lot of ergonomic issues, and that's,
that we have to look
Yep.
at, when it comes into the health.
and how we do the,
we do.
yeah. Okay, so how do you assess these hazards? And this is where a written industrial hygiene program can come in and really help you out. Okay, you are able to document, this is how we're gonna do it here. Okay, and so what happens, you're the safety guy, you've been there, Don, for 13 years, and all of a sudden another company says, Don, I'm gonna give you 5 times as much money to come here and work. What's gonna happen then to your company? When all of that leaves, and you didn't have any of this stuff documented, where does it go? It goes right out the door, right? But a good written program, we've got that documented so that in case somebody leaves, we've got that data. Okay, we're able to deal with it. So how do you assess it? It starts off with initial screening, okay? And the initial screening, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong.
You're wrong.
Does not have to be an industrial hygienist to do some of this stuff, right?
Correct.
I can actually have somebody out on my workforce, somebody in my safety committee with a little bit of training on how to run some tools. They can actually do some initial screening for me, okay? But it's a good idea that in your program you document, okay? What's the old OSHA saying? If it wasn't documented, you guys know that one pretty well. That's one of the reasons that I'm such a strong believer in the industrial hygiene process, okay, because it demands good documentation, okay? Why did you decide you wanted to sample here instead of here? Okay, what was the reasoning behind that? What good is it to put the kind of documentation like that down? Is anybody else ever going to come in and see that or review that? So it's vital information for them to have. Document all the sampling data, including the tests and the processes that were going on while we were sampling, okay? So if I'm sampling over here and there's some welding going on over here, can that affect the sampling that I'm doing here? Absolutely. So I need to document that. This is what's going on around, okay? Talks about identify and document the variables. What time of year did we do this? Are we checking for dust in the summer or are we checking for dust in the winter? Not going to be a lot of dust out there today, right? Maybe in the summertime there could be. Workload. How many years of experience do these people have? Is it somebody who's brand new, or have they been doing it forever and ever and ever? What kind of equipment are they using? What kind of welding rod are they using? What is the equipment that they're actually using? So you want to document that in your sampling. Okay, Dave, I'm going to pick on you. So this is a kind of an illustration of some basic industrial hygiene for assessing and managing. And as you can see, you're going to make some kind of a basic characterization, and you'll do that with your initial stuff, right?
Yes.
And that gives me an idea of what it is. And so now I'm looking at my exposures to my people. How are they using it? Where are they using it? And I've really got some choices. This is okay. It's I don't know, or no, this isn't okay. Okay? So if we decide it's okay, then we're going to kind of reassess every now and then. We're going to go back through this. If we come in and say, I don't know, we're going to get some more information, okay? And then we're going to confirm it, go back and keep trying. If it's not acceptable, we're going to control it. We're going to do something different, either eliminate it, change it, modify it, some kind of control, and then confirm that control is working, go back, is it still there? What's our exposure? Is it still unacceptable? We've got to keep on this plan, do, check, act cycle. Is a very huge piece of industrial hygiene. Okay? Some ways that we can categorize things. You'll see a lot of color coding. Your handouts are not black and white, or in black and white, so you don't get to see the color coding. But color coding can make things, green means it's good. Yellow means, okay, we might need to, in this case, procedures, training, or that is blue. Yellow is going to say we've got some hazards, we've got to do periodic monitoring. Maybe we need to do more monitoring, and some things might say, no, we're not going to do this. We need to control it. We cannot accept people being exposed to these things, okay? So with an industrial hygiene program, it is vital to keep records of all the sampling data. Why do we want that stuff?
Well, for one reason, you have employees that are exposed to things. They have a right to that information. They have a right to know what they were exposed to and how bad it was. You also want to look at, every time you do sampling, that's one data point. That's one picture in time. That tells you what happened that day at that time. If you redo that sampling, that tells you what happened that day at that time. They may be different.
And they oftentimes will be different.
And it can be as different as you do your day shift, and then you do sampling on swing shift, and you have two completely different results. That tells you something. Or you put in control measures, and then you do sampling, and then your exposures go up. That tells you something.
Yep.
Something's gone wrong, and you need to understand that has gone wrong and figure out why.
And so having these records gives you this long-term track of what's going on and why it's going on. And it's really important that we keep these things, okay? So some of your initial sampling can be performed with what we call direct reading instruments. Dave, you want to share a couple direct reading instruments?
You know what? I have one on my phone. If I remember where I put it. Yes, it's a sound level meter.
Boom.
So I can go and do an assessment for noise anywhere, anytime. I took it to a Motley Crue concert. It's quite
Spiked.
But yeah, this is an assessment tool.
And it's a direct, this is what's going on and this is what it says, okay? A direct.
Right. Now, does this mean that I take this out and now I've met everything that I need to do for noise? No.
No.
This gives me a data point. This tells me where my problem areas probably are. This tells me where I need to focus my attention. This also tells me where I don't need to focus my attention.
Right. Right. And there's a lot of different direct reading types of instruments, not just for noise. What are a couple of other ones?
Carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, multiple chemicals, oxygen, four-way gas meters that
Right.
you use for confined space entry. Typically looking at oxygen, lower explosive limits, hydrogen sulfide, and one of the carbon oxides.
And these direct level readings are telling you this is what's going on at, like Dave said, at this point in time. And from that, then we make our decisions. Do we need to have maybe somebody come in and look at this a little closer? Or are we so far below anything that maybe we don't have to worry about this? A direct reading can give us some of that. So now we have to start documenting this stuff, right? And in your workbook on page 15, your handout, is a copy of this. Now this is a sheet that one of our Sharp companies that went on into VPP developed and shared with us. And they're able to go through, and they use Clorox bleach just to show it's a number 2 in health, 0 in flammability, 1 in reactivity, B, their PPE required, and somewhere they had maybe a different sheet, but that tells them something. Okay, and then they can look and go through, is there formaldehyde in it, is there methylene chloride, lead, all of these different chemicals, and what are the routes of entry, how does it get in there, what are the control measures that we can use, and they have a good understanding of all the chemicals that they use of the physical product, okay, and based on this, now they can start saying, okay, this one is a higher priority than that one. Okay, so it's giving them a starting point. Now, you've got a number of these things in your handouts, and we're not saying anyone is perfect. We're giving you examples of some ways that we've seen other companies do this. Okay, so you've got a copy of this. So we've gone through and we've done our initial stuff, our direct reading stuff, and we've identified that we have some hazards. Okay, so what do? Well, now we're going to start looking at more full shift sampling, okay? Typical and worst case, what are the exposure levels over a period of time, right? You feel free to, we're getting into your ballywhack and out of mine. So again, and that's going to be based on what we did in our initial screening. Okay, so if there's areas in our initial screening that said this isn't an issue, we probably don't have to worry about that. But if there's areas our initial screening said, this is close. Okay, like Shauna was saying, we've got some stuff that's getting up there close to the Pels. Okay, now we're gonna start looking at more full shift sampling. What are the jobs, what are the tasks, the processes? If we can't do screening, and then document all that data. What did we do? How did we do it? What was going on when we did it? So we're starting to build this track record, right? For want of better terms, okay? So our full shift sampling is going to look at those tasks and processes that our initial sampling said, okay, there might have been issues here, or something that we couldn't get into in the initial, okay? Those are things for full screen. The data then again has to be precise, it has to be thorough, because somebody else is going to come back and look at that down the road a year or a month or 2 years later, and they need to know kind of what was going on at the time. Because if they don't, the data is almost worthless to them. Okay, and how many times have you seen that back at, well, I know you've been on a VPP audit or two with me where we were actually on a site, the team looked at the industrial hygiene program and it was like, good stuff. We actually give them 4 years in VPP. We're going to come back in 4 years and reevaluate. The safety guy left. New safety person come in, didn't cut it, left. Another safety person come in. We came back in to do another audit. They couldn't find their industrial hygiene program. They had no idea where it was. What was that OSHA saying? If it's not written, even though we had seen it, other team members had seen it 4 years ago, they didn't have the data.
That's the other benefit of having either OSHA or the workman comp carrier come out, because they will provide you a report. And
Yeah,
you just file
and
it.
now you're starting to get that
They get all your data.
Yeah.
You just file it. Or
we're in a place where you can find it. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so has to be precise and thorough. Make sure that you're taking enough samples to properly evaluate. You know, the samples has to be during the operation is likely to cause exposure, so you don't want to sample for hexchrome when you're not doing hexchrome welding. It's not going to do you any good, right? And make sure you're covering all work shifts, okay? This is another health hazard matrix that one of our consultants actually provided to a company. They went through all of the different production areas and then determine whether it was a 1, overexposures or documented or expected, or number 2, overexposures possible. So then they went through there and they put the dates down and some ongoing monitoring. So again, a tool for tracking that is in your worksheets on page 16. So then you want to always ask yourself, have we missed anything? And for me, it comes back to this Plan, Do, Check, Act, which we kind of renamed for Sharp as Plan, Do, Check, Adjust, because it never really stops. You plan, you do it, you check it, you adjust it, you plan it, you do it, you check it, you just continually round in circles.
So I was at a conference and I heard the best definition of a good industrial hygienist. A good industrial hygienist will sample something and then question the results.
And we've got some really good industrial hygienists who work for Oregon OSHA.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean, they do, they'll even question safe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
when I had Jeff out, he's even called safe and said, hey.
And
this is
said,
what you found.
explain.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really vital that we collect and document that data so that somebody else can come through and look at it again. And then decide on a strategy to monitor again, because we don't want to stop. So do you want to do it every month? That might be exorbitant. For some things, it might not be. You know, we would do it every year, every 2 years, every 5 years. That's kind of up to you guys, and it's really going to be based on what you've found so far.
Unless there's a rule that requires.
Yep. Or if the process changes or the schedules change. There are a lot of rules that say you're going to sample every
3 months,
3 months.
6 months.
Okay? So it pays to be familiar with your rules. Guess what? Most of the industrial hygienists are kind of familiar with those rules. They can help you with that. Okay? So we talked about the industrial hygienist's job. It's really about recognizing and evaluating. And they've got to look at, what's in the air, what's on these surfaces. Do we do a wipe sample to see, are we getting stuff landing on those surfaces? What's in this stuff that we're dealing with, okay? What's in this thing? We look at, there's a couple approaches. We talked about direct reading, sampling, followed by a lab analysis. And they've got all kinds of little neat tubes and sniffers and toys. That then they will take a reading with those and they will send it into a lab, and the lab will come out with an analysis and tell you what they found. What is in this substance? What is in this sample that was sent? Okay? Now, it's up to the industrial hygienist to start looking at things, whether it's air, whether it's mists, fogs, molecules, vapors, smokes, and how do you make these determinations, Dave?
So every form of matter is solid, liquid, gas, or if things have gone terribly wrong, plasma. don't stand in the plasma. You guys know what a chemical is? What's a chemical? Chemical is everything the universe is made out of.
Yeah.
So I have seen ads for things that contain no chemicals. I've also seen ads for things that are all natural. Does that mean it's all completely safe?
Not
Because last
necessarily.
I checked, poison oak was all natural. And I don't like poison oak.
It doesn't like you either, does
So
it?
is botulism.
So,
So basically, when we're looking at any particular substance, what is it that is what's it made out of? So
Where did it come from?
If it's a petroleum-based solvent, it's probably you're looking at vapors. If it's a dust, it's a solid,
Right.
but it's a really really small one. With liquids, you aerosolize it, so it's a mist or a vapor,
Right.
or fog.
And a lot of the stuff that the industrial hygienists will run into, most of the industrial hygienists have run into something similar before, and so they've got this experience that they can draw on to quickly and easily to tell the difference between a mist or a fog.
And if you take nothing else away from this, A fume is not a vapor. A fume is what you get when you're welding. It's
Right.
really, really, really small particles. of
It's
smoke.
not wet.
That is a fume. So if you go and you smell something that smells weird, that's not a fume.
Okay? So, when do you evaluate exposure? Okay, if you've got particularly hazardous stuff that you're using or could be generated by what you're doing, it's a good idea to evaluate it and reevaluate it on an ongoing basis. If employees have said, I don't feel good, or this is making me sick, evaluate. Okay, even if the employee is a chronic complainer, you need to evaluate it at least once so that you can satisfy yourself that these levels are okay. Okay? If more than one employee is complaining, you really need to find out what the problem is and do.
One of the things that on the safety data sheets will tell you symptoms of exposure.
Yes.
So if you get people complaining about those same things,
Yeah.
take a look.
Take a look at that and see, is that something that this material causes? Exposures or incidents or near misses have occurred. Maybe we want to reevaluate something, okay? If it's required, like Dave said earlier, by any kind of other standard or legal requirement, some things you may have to sample every 3 months. Just depends on what the code says, okay? If changes have occurred in your process or equipment or the chemicals that you're using, you want to go back and reevaluate and find out where your levels are.
And sometimes that change isn't in the process. Sometimes that change is the person doing it.
Okay? Controls have been implemented, their effectiveness needs to be determined, just like you did back there, Shauna, where you guys made some changes, you brought somebody in to verify it, you're going to have somebody come back in and verify it. It's an ongoing, okay? Any other instance where the employer, where you guys determine that initial sampling or additional sampling is warranted, do it. Do some more exposure monitoring, okay? An example of this Trina likes to talk about, and I'll try to do as best as I can. So she was doing an evaluation, an employee working in a rubber manufacturing facility, and they used a catalyst of thiram in this mixture to make the rubber soft and porous and do what they needed to do to make tires, okay? So she was talking to this employee and he's saying, I get these rashes down the back of my neck and it just, and it makes me tired. I get a headache at the end of the day. She says, well, is it worse on Monday or worse on Friday? Oh, it's terrible by Friday. I can't even go out and drink with my buddies on Friday night anymore. It just makes me sick. He said, I got this metallic or garlic aftertaste. But the thing that was really bugging him was part of his social life was going out hanging with his buddies and having a drink on Friday or Saturday night, and it was making him sick. He couldn't do it. Well, Trina did a little bit of research, found out that thiram calls these disulfuric, and I probably said it wrong, reactions very much like antabuse. Okay, how many of us remember what antabuse was supposed to do?
That was a different meeting.
Yeah. But this guy was absorbing antabuse in his work. Okay, and they didn't know it until, and that's why I talk about it being an art form. You know, it took her a little while and a lot of questions, delving in deep to find, aha, this is what's causing it. So, very interesting. And I imagine Dave's got some stories like this too. So, then we start to look at what are our exposure limits, okay? What is acceptable and what is not acceptable, okay? And the PEL is what we call the permissible exposure limit, and it's calculated using a time-weighted 8-hour time average, right? Yes. Typically, they're going to post the PEL in parts per million. How many parts of this stuff can be in a million?
Well, basically, for dust, or for everything except dusts and fumes, it's measured in parts per million. So if you have 1 million parts of something, how many parts of that are actually this thing?
Right.
The other one is milligrams per cubic meter of air. So if you were to take a theoretical cubic meter of air and weigh it, and it has this stuff in it, how much does it?
How much of that is in it? And then we have what we call a short-term exposure limit. And Dave, explain that one for me.
This is essentially a 15 to 30 minute exposure, typically 15. For some substances it's 30 because part of it was based on the technology for measuring it at the time. But basically it's it's a short window of exposure to something, and this is really useful if you have either using this material for a short time, or you have a short time where your exposures are going to go way up for whatever reason.
Right. And then we have something we call a ceiling. And a ceiling is a limit, okay? We don't go over that, period. And now, these, correct me if I'm wrong, but they are right out of the OSHA rules. You can go into the OSHA rules, and there's a link to it, although on paper your link isn't going to work very well. But
As much as you want.
the Oregon rules for air contaminants, subdivision C, has
It's a list
a
of,
very
Actually,
exhaustive,
3
3 lists.
3 lists.
Yeah, and these are things that are PELs, STELs, and ceilings. Okay, that's the OSHA language. Remember, these chemicals limits, these exposure limits, a lot of them were put in there back in the what, 40s?
70s.
But based on some information from the 40s. OSHA does not update these programs very well. Part of the rulemaking process makes it hard for them to lower a PEL, and it makes it easy for industry to keep it from being lowered. And so a lot of these things are really, really old, okay? They are the minimum acceptable, right?
So you can do this and meet all applicable government standards, which puts you on the same playing field as the people that built the Yugo and drove the Titanic.
There you go. So what we really work for, and what we encourage all the Sharp companies and all the VPP companies to do, and a best practice, is to go get better than the OSHA standard and start looking at more stringent levels, okay? Threshold values, the TVLs set up by the AGCIH are much more robust, but also more favorable to the employee who's got to be exposed to this stuff. As an employee working, I would much rather be exposed to these levels than these levels, okay? Because the OSHA levels are in many cases too high. We know they're too high, but we can't change the rule.
It's hard.
Okay, so there's the recommended exposure levels, the RELs, that's something NIOSH puts out, right?
Yes.
This is a German one, and don't ask me to say it, Trina can say it, but these are more stringent than the OSHA PELs. All in all, less than 1,000 chemicals are covered by these standards, by any of these standards, okay? And there are well more than 1,000 chemicals out there. The wheels, I'm not sure what that one is. The California STDs. This.
And biological hazards.
Okay. And the OSHA annotated.
I'm teasing.
Okay. Well, yeah, gotcha. It took a while. So this is our Oregon OSHA's annotated table. This table is several pages deep, but it shows you the CAS number of the chemical, what the OSHA PEL is, what OSHA allows, what Cal OSHA, what the NIOSH REL is, and what the AGCIH, thank you, the TLVs, the threshold limit values. And as you can see, OSHA is going to allow you quite a bit more than these guys will allow you, okay? These are the ones that we want to aim at. Just because we can pass with a D-, do we want to? Okay, there's a lot more stringent stuff out there. And guess what? You do not have to be limited to these. If you can demand half of one of these, you're that much better. Okay, and that's totally up to you guys. All of these are on our Oregon OSHA's webpage. You can feel free to go in there and read them to your heart's content. There's, like I say, pages of them. So, the other piece that we want to make sure that you understand is quality control and calibration. Okay, if you've got, Dave, I'm going to let you talk about calibration and the importance.
Air sample. So one of the things that we have to know when we're doing air monitoring in air sampling, so we're running a specific amount of air through a filter, either like a charcoal filter or a cassette or something. So one of the things we have to know is how much air are we drawing through that filter. So we calibrate the pump to a particular liters per minute. We pre-calibrate to make sure it's running the number of liters per minute we need. And then we post-calibrate it afterwards to see if it's still actually pulling that same amount of air. Because if it didn't, what happened?
So the calibration is vital to ensuring that the readings you're getting are correct. So you're going to calibrate it with a known, you'll sample an unknown, and then you'll recalibrate it again with a known to make sure that the machine is working like it's supposed to.
So it's pulling the amount of air. And the reason, the huge reason, is because we're measuring over a period of time. We know we're pulling, say, 2 liters a minute per air through that filter. We know that we ran it for 400 minutes. When the lab looks at that, they can break down and say, this is what the exposure was based on the amount of air that went through that.
Right.
And if I don't know the amount of air that went through that, that sample is no good. It doesn't tell me anything.
And your quality control is really important in that when you are documenting that we did this sampling, what was the equipment that we used? What was the calibration medium that we used? And all of that stuff is really vital for building that record, right?
Right.
You want to talk about spikes and blanks? Because blanks for me are things you shouldn't.
So when we send the sample to the lab, one of the things that we also send, so if I'm sending, if I'm doing sampling on a cartridge, I have a whole bunch of cartridges that I can use. So I have this one that I use for my sample, and I'm going to take another one that I didn't use, and that's my blank, and I'm going to send both of those to the lab. They're going to look at both of them for whatever the contaminant I'm looking for is. If they find some on the blank, then they have to correct for the sample that I sent in, because obviously there was some kind of cross-contamination at some point through that whole process. Usually I'm taking a blank from the office, I'm not taking the blank out with me, so it didn't come from the site usually. It's something else in how that was made, but if it's from the same batch, at least they know that there's something in that batch, and then they can correct for that. So if there was something that was already on it, that's not your fault. And I don't want to say, well, your folks are exposed to 1 billion times the limit, but oh yeah, it was contaminated. Sorry.
Going in. Right. Okay. So sampling methodologies. The media you use.
So adsorption means that it clings to the surface. That's typically with our charcoal filters. It actually sticks to the surface of that charcoal. Absorption means it soaks into something. Filtration, that's typically your filters, and it's filtering that stuff out and it's capturing on the filter. Chemical reaction. Trigger tubes.
Okay.
Electric change tubes.
Right.
Great example of that. So there's a reaction. Grab is where I take a bag and I suck air from the lab from the area into that bag, and I send the bag in. We don't do that real often.
But pump calibration is vital again to that whole process, because if you don't calibrate your pumps, the information you gathered is worthless.
Meaningless.
Yeah.
Wipe samples, you'll see this sometimes. You'll come out and wipe a certain area and send that in to see what it is. Typically, we'll use that for metals, like lead or cadmium.
So if you go back to work and your millwrights like to have coffee in the same room that they do some welding in, it's a good idea to wipe the table where they're setting their coffee, send that in and find out what it is that's landing in their coffee. Okay?
The other thing is you still have people that smoke. If they don't wash their hands first and they go out and smoke, or they go and eat, have lunch, what just happened?
Whatever they were working with.
They ate whatever was on everywhere.
Yeah, yep.
Not necessarily the best idea.
So the chemical agent routes of exposure, inhalation, dermal, ingestion, there's a lot of stuff out there. We talk about dermal, new frontier. There's some, what do we call those little tiny nanoparticles? that for all we know that your PPE won't keep it out. It's that small, it'll go right through. Again, a new frontier there. They really don't have some exposure limits yet on some of that stuff.
Yeah, we know a lot about hundreds of chemicals. There are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of chemicals out there.
I'm sorry, I'm probably the only one in the room that missed this point, but explain again, Mark, what is New Frontier?
New Frontier is like the nanoparticles that we're running across.
New things that are happening.
They're developing stuff every day that has never been around before and nobody knows anything about.
Okay. Well,
You know,
wouldn't that also relate to the permeability of whatever PPE you're using to
Right.
see what the chemical is going to, how it's going to react?
absolutely going to relate. But again, nobody knows yet. Nobody, I mean, the science hasn't caught up with it yet.
Yeah.
So New Frontier is not a proper noun?
No.
It is not,
It-
it's,
it-
basically it's a
Standardized.
process. I'm sorry, it's a process, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's a concept.
Yeah, that's
new
what
stuff.
confused me. I was
Okay.
thinking, well, I think of Frontier Airlines.
Oh, no.
So that's.
We're getting into uncharted territory.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry, that's what was confusing.
Okay, yeah, it's not Captain Kirk. Okay.
Yeah, one of the problems with establishing exposure limits for newer chemicals is you need data, just like everything
Right.
else. And the only thing that really works really well is time. So
To gather the data.
So the epidemiological data for people exposed to something, that can take time. You remember when those popcorn workers sued the popcorn company, the microwave popcorn company, and they lost because there was no data showing that that chemical caused the problems they were experiencing. A few years later,
There was enough data.
there was an update and it showed that yes, indeed, this chemical causes those symptoms they experience.
We have some of that data, but we don't have all of it, especially with the nano stuff. I mean, it's getting down so small that, you know, the microscopes that we used to use in high school won't even see the stuff. It's a new frontier. It really, truly is.
So one of the problems can be that most chemicals, if they get on you, they'll either do damage or they soak in, but you don't necessarily see that with solids. But with nanoparticles, that may be out the window. There may be nanoparticles that are so small that they actually breach that skin barrier.
Is a nanoparticle like a microbead? Like a plastic microbead?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, microparticles would actually be a class in and of itself, a type of chemical.
Would you find the microparticles more in a fume or?
Actually,
in
no.
metal
The fume is
or
the particles in the fume are too big.
Oh, they're
too
smaller
big.
than the.
Yeah.
They're way
Right.
smaller.
We're talking,
yeah.
we're talking
Yeah,
tiny,
Tiny.
Yeah.
I mean,
Gets
when we
deep
talk
into the
about
lungs.
when we talk about things like asbestos or silica, we're talking 1 to 10 microns in size, really super small. Microparticles are smaller than that.
Wow.
Much smaller. Okay, so accuracy talks about the accuracy. Sorry.
Thank you.
Comfy hadn't kicked in yet. So accuracy talks about the accuracy of the method itself. So not every sample method, actually most sample methods are not 100% accurate. Most of them are around 95% accurate. So for example, noise. If I'm looking at noise on a really good meter that's really expensive, my accuracy is plus or minus 2 decibels. Most of the air sampling methods are around 95% with air accuracy. Drager tubes, those colorimetric tubes, accuracy can be off by as much as 25%.
So it's important that you note that in your sampling data, right?
So you have to know what the accuracy of that method is because you have to account for that. And in a lot of cases, like with our lab, they'll actually account for the accuracy and give you your pluses and minuses. When you're sampling for your stuff, now when we sample for compliance purposes, we give you the accuracy. So if it was plus or minus, we'll take the minus and say, yeah, we'll subtract the minus from what the results were and say, this is what your results were. That's for compliance purposes. Do not do that for yourself. Add that on, because it could be up to that high, and you need to understand that.
Right. Right.
And you don't get extra bonus points if you don't. Right, so sensitivity, who here deals with lead? Okay. Sensitivity is really important, especially for people that are, or actually lead paint, this is a huge issue. There is a specific level of detection, a level of quantification that a lab can use. They can test down to a certain point, but it's not zero. They can test down to a certain point, and then that's as best as they can do. When they're looking at something like lead paint, for example, they can't tell you that this has 0 lead in it. They can only tell you this has less than this amount, but we don't actually know. Some tests for asbestos, they can only tell you it's less than 1%, but they can't do better than that. Other tests they can test down to for 0, so it depends on the method.
So Dave, the lead standard has changed, recently changed, correct?
No, I'm working on it, but it hasn't actually changed.
Okay, so the point of working on it is lowering the permissible exposure?
Actually, in this, what I'm working on is not to lower the permissible exposure limit, it's to lower the blood lead levels.
Okay.
And doing some other things. But right now, so if I want to say this lead paint, or this paint has no lead in it, and I send the sample to the lab, they cannot tell me that.
Right.
There is no test to say that there is no lead in it, other than doing an air test when someone's working on it and just making sure that they weren't overexposed.
All right, so again, anticipate, recognize, evaluate, and control, and following that plan, do, check, adjust model, okay? Your written program really needs to provide you with a very logical and methodical approach to enable you or your IH to record and document each step of the process so that somebody can come in behind and say this is where they were with a good degree of accuracy and specificity. Okay? So this is another example, and this was...
all that.
Yeah. It's about anticipating, recognizing, evaluating, and controlling, but when you're doing a risk assessment, a hazard assessment, trying to identify and define these relationships. And then the exposure assessment, characterize the risk, then use the hierarchy of control to try to help you control these risks. They're in your book on pages, I call it a book, but on pages 18 to 20 is some examples of what we call similar exposure group, or it's also known as hazard banding, which is basically, explain what hazard banding is.
Hazard banding is a newer way of thinking about exposures, because one of the issues we know is because there's a lot of chemicals we don't really know a lot about. So basically it's taking a more holistic approach and looking at the substances in question and determining whether or not there's a problem.
And it's very similar to a similar exposure group, taking a bunch of different exposures and grouping them together and say, these have these commonalities. Correct?
Yeah.
For the most part.
Yeah, it's really confusing, and people that know everything about it cannot explain it very well.
So the employer in your industrial hygiene program is going to allow you to do this, but you need to be able to recognize the hazards. You need to manage and prevent work-related injuries and illnesses. That's a requirement. The employer needs to be the link to the health professionals that can diagnose symptoms. So if you're getting people coming up and reporting a similar symptom or illness, a big part of what the employer wants to be able to do is connect back with the medical professionals and see, are we being exposed to something? And maybe share the SDSs with the medical local medical folks, okay?
One other piece to that is if there are employees that are out sick a lot, most general practitioners do not think to ask, is this, what do you do at work?
Right.
So they may actually have a workplace exposure and have absolutely no idea. But if you have people that are out sick, that's one of the things to look at is why were you out sick? What is it you do? And
do you have somebody in the same job doing the same kinds of things? Yeah. The employer needs to train employees, and the employer needs to conduct medical surveillance and making sure that you're watching this stuff. Okay? It's vital that your IH predict the symptoms so that it can recognize the symptom occurring and enable you then to evaluate the workplace and control that hazard. The types of hazards present, the extent of exposures, the types of airborne stuff, the fumes, mists, aerosols, and then how to determine other exposure routes. Is it being absorbed? Is it being ingested, injected? How your employees are exposed. This is what your written industrial program will enable you to do, okay? It will enable you to answer these questions.
When I was a brand new IH, one of the best pieces of advice I heard is walk out onto the floor and stand there, not where you're gonna get hit by something. Close your eyes. What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you feel? What do you taste? Use your senses. And that's going to give you a lot of information, and that's going to help you identify where you probably need to focus things.
Okay.
Just to start.
So once we've identified hazards, we got to do something about them. We cannot identify it and walk away happily. Okay? If we know there's a hazard out there, we've got to do something about it. One of the things that the VPP program requires, and a true best practice, is making use of certified professional resources, a CSP, Certified Safety and Health Manager, a Certified Industrial Hygienist. Not to say you have to have one on site, but know where you can access them, either through your workers' comp carrier, through Oregon OSHA consultation, through private, through corporate, have access to those folks. It's vital that we follow some kind of a hierarchy of controls on fixing things, okay? And the hierarchy of controls is simply what works best. Use it before you use something that doesn't work as well, okay? It also talks about having a hazard control surveillance program. So if I tell you, Bo, you're under surveillance, what does that mean?
Being monitored.
You're being watched, right? So if you are surveilling your hazard controls, what's that mean? You're making sure that it's doing what you put it in place to do, right? And that's probably where most companies fall down. They have a problem. They'll fix something and they'll forget about it. And guess what happens? A couple of years later, it comes back. And they'll fix it again and they'll forget about it and it'll come back. And it continues to do that. And a hazard control surveillance program is like, okay, we fixed it, we're going to watch it. We're going to make sure this fix did what we want it to do. If we watch it for a year or so and everything's staying, we probably don't have to watch it as regularly, but keep an eye on those things.
I would like to tell you a little story about that. Worked with a guy, and this is the most elegant solution I've ever heard of, but it also helps you understand you don't always have to do things the way you've always done it simply because you've always done it that way. So I knew a guy, he worked at McDonnell Douglas. They build airplanes. One of the things that they do is they have to run all their wires from the back of the airplane to the front of the airplane. They use PVC pipe. And they put the PVC pipe in the plane, or put the wires in the PVC pipe, put the pipe in the plane, put it in place. It's white, it stands out, so they go in and paint it black inside the plane. All sorts of exposure problems that they had to deal with. So they had to put in all these control measures, ventilation, the guy's in a respirator, air supply, it's just a pain in the ass. So the guy comes in and says, why don't you use black PVC pipe? What just happened? So the cost is the same, but now we don't have the exposure.
We don't have a hazard.
Now we don't have all the control measures, and we have a guy who's not spending hours doing something he doesn't need to do anymore. Most elegant solution ever.
Yeah.
So always keep in mind, that you do not always have to do this thing that same way simply because you've always done it that way. Sometimes there's a better way.
Yep. Occupational health care program is really about making sure that safety and medical are touching bases, so that if we're having some exposures, we're thinking back to where those exposures could be coming from and how can we control those things. Maintenance, predictive, preventive maintenance to ensure that things aren't breaking down so we're not getting into these upset conditions is really vital to a good solid hazard prevention control program. And then tracking the hazard correction. We can't really do surveillance of it unless we've got some kind of tracking mechanism that we can say, okay, this was done on such and such a date, this is what was done, this is how well it's working, and we're watching as it moves along. Talk about disciplinary system and exposure or emergency preparedness are all a big piece of hazard prevention and controls. But once we know what the hazards are, right, we got to do something about them. And the most effective way to do something about them is what we're going to call the the hierarchy of controls. And what's interesting about the hierarchy of controls is what works the best tends to be the best business value. Okay, what works the least tends to be the least business value. And the example would be respirators. Okay, we are spraying something bad that we don't want to breathe, so we're going to put our guys in respirators. Okay, the guy like me gets to go shave or get a different job. Okay, the guy who can wear a respirator, what all does it take to wear a respirator?
So it starts with the medical evaluation. Because
Cha-ching.
a respirator puts an increased strain on your cardiopulmonary system.
And how often do we got to do that medical thing?
Do that initially,
Cha-ching.
and then whenever there's a change,
Cha-ching,
either the
cha-ching,
type of
cha-ching.
respirator, the duration of use of the respirator, the change in the person, or if someone else reports that person seems to be having issues while
So
wearing the
it's an
respirator.
ongoing medical.
Also, a lot of doctors are putting a sunset on their medical evaluations. So if you take a look at if you have people wearing respirators, take a look at the little letter you get back. It may say, this is good until such and such date. And then when that date comes and goes, you do not have a valid medical evaluation anymore.
If there's been no changes, don't they have to have it every 3 years anyway?
It's not a requirement in general or under the respirator rule. It's just whenever there's a change or whenever their doctor says so. So that letter that you get back, and there's sometimes people just get the letter, they put it in the file, and they don't even read it. Sometimes it says this person's not okay to wear a respirator.
We have a 12-month turnaround on our.
Right.
We have an employee because of our epoxy tanks and the abrasives that they have
Right.
to get into this.
And then we've got the
Clean.
cost of the
So-
canisters and replacing
and all
the
of that.
masks.
You have
And
ongoing
He gets
maintenance.
his medical every year, and while he's at his medical, he gets a refit test. So we
Yep.
have both documentation going with him.
so there's some cost associated, and the cost with the PPE, the respirator program, goes up every year.
Every year.
Whereas maybe if we'd have done something higher on the hierarchy of control early on, paid for it once, hazard gone, we don't worry about it again.
The other problem with PPE is it requires humans to be 100% perfect 100% of the time.
That's going to happen,
I
right?
have never met anyone like that, no matter what they thought of themselves.
So the employer needs to remember, eliminate that hazard where we can. It's the best thing we can do because it's gone. We don't have to deal with it anymore. But we can't always do that, so the next best thing we can do is substitute something less hazardous that will still do the job. Again, we can't always do that. Now we're getting into let's reduce exposure, guard it, barricade it, keep people away from it. We can't do that. Then we got to protect our people and then surveil it, okay? Types of hazards just depends on what we do. There's hazards associated with everything. The most important thing to remember though is this hierarchy of controls, okay? It works for safety, it works for health, it's vital. So, your written program, on pages 37 to 40, you have an outline for a written industrial hygiene program. It is a 4-page document. On pages 41 through 46, you have an actual sample of a written industrial hygiene program that was shared with us by a VPP company. Okay, the names have been removed to protect the innocents, but it is almost a fill-in-the-blank thing that you can start with as a outline. Your program helps you to determine, identify, analyze, and control health-related hazards. Your program needs to include the IH surveys that you're doing. You need to dictate what our ongoing IH sampling strategy is going to look like moving forward, how we're going to use those sampling results to actually control hazards, and what kind of IH expertise do we have access to. Okay, maybe it's somebody on site who is an industrial hygienist tech. Maybe we go to SAFE or to another workers' comp carrier or to Oregon OSHA, private. However we do that, we want to dictate that and put it into our written program.
And one of the things you want to make sure you differentiate is those things that you're doing periodic monitoring because you were close to a level or there's a rule requirement to do so. But a good, solid IH program will do a reassessment of everything every 3 to 5 years.
To make sure we know where we are. Yeah. Okay, so your program should cover the identified IH hazards that you found in your workplace, have some standard procedures for how we're going to do routine ongoing self-analysis, have a hazard reporting system so that employees can report hazards back up to you so you can do something about them, and what additional sampling is going to be required. Okay? Program, it's a living document. It's going to change. It's going to evolve and grow with your company. Expect that. Okay? But it's a very good recording of what's been going on, what your hazard levels are, what your control levels have done, all of that stuff. Okay? Your program should identify the health hazards or the lack of. And how do we determine there is a lack of a health hazard? Negative monitoring, right?
What do you know and how do you know it?
One of the things that I've always felt is that a good VPP site is going to be able to tell me what health hazards they have and what health hazards they don't have. And they know that because they have sampled that and they've found enough negative monitoring that they can say categorically, we don't have to worry about this. Okay? What are the exposures? What are the problem tasks and risks? And then your program is going to help you to decide which one of these conditions need to be measured and how often we need to measure it. You know, what are the acute hazards that your people might be exposed to? And you're going to list those in your report, in your program. What are the chronic hazards? What are some of the long-term effects that you want to be looking for? And you'll dictate that. What are the routes of exposure? You know, are they going to breathe it? Are they going to eat it? Are they going to absorb it or touch it? What are the target organs of these things? Okay, your written program is going to help you think. Now, there's a ton of hazards to think about. Okay, we're only talking about a few of them, but many of these are just safety, but most of these are health and safety. Okay, and the reason for this slide is really just be aware of what you do, what your people are exposed to as they're doing their jobs. Don had a really great example of this. One of the things that his company does is works on equipment that has been sold to an employer who used that equipment, and then they bring that equipment back for Don's people to fix. Well, what's been in that stuff? What did they use that equipment for? How does Don know it's safe for his people to dig into that, right?
Exactly.
You want to share a little bit?
I think these gals could probably share it better than I can because they're the ones that change the process. So Kim, you want to speak to it?
Well, sure. A lot of times we go out in the field to work on different John Deere equipment. So we have to identify in the field, has it been exposed? Is it in a field that we can't enter? So we have this, process that starts at the top, talking to our service manager about identifying what it's been exposed to, what it's in, what areas we are going to access, and what needs to be done before we can even go out there and address it. And we use a website too that we found that we can punch these little chemicals in, and it tells us what parameters that we need to wear for
Right.
PPE or
Right.
be able to get to it. So.
And again, in this scenario, sometimes we're talking about pesticides. Yeah.
Yeah. So just be aware. There's all kinds of stuff that you could be exposed to that maybe even some of it's coming from outside, and you want to be aware of that. Okay. Your program needs to establish some really specific procedures and methods for how you're going to identify, analyze, and control these health hazards so that people aren't getting sick at work. And your written industrial hygiene program will enable you to do that. Talks about I-8 surveys. What additional time do you need? What additional expertise or technical equipment that you might want to be using that is above and beyond your baseline, that maybe your baseline told you you needed to do a little bit more in this area, okay, so that you can determine what contaminants are present and quantify the exposures so that you can control them correctly. Sampling strategy. Describe in your written program what are the protocols that you're going to use. Okay, what are the methods that you've implemented that you will enable you to accurately assess your employees' exposure to these health hazards that are associated with the work you're doing. It's vital that you get this into your written industrial hygiene program. And in ongoing sampling strategy, what is the objective data that you're using to identify health hazards and assess these exposures? What does that look like? And you'll document that. Your preliminary baseline stuff, your grab samples, your initial screening, hopefully that's already in your program. If you haven't got it yet, you're going to want to go ahead and retrofit this in, right, Dave?
Yeah.
If the baseline suggests there's potential for more exposure, then we're going to come in and look a little deeper, right? We'll start doing the full shift or short-term sampling to find out just exactly what these levels look like. And how do we do that? Well, we need to prioritize it, right? We can't just blanket run out and sample everything, can we? Be a little expensive, wouldn't it? So there are some ways. NIOSH and OSHA has methods. Your samples are going to be sent to a certified, accredited laboratory, and you're going to be comparing. They're going to be comparing your sampling results to the minimum levels at the lab, right? But it's vital that you report back to employees what you found out in the sampling. Why is that important?
Well, probably the biggest one is I think we've had more complaint inspections from employees who had no idea what was going on. They saw that sampling happen, nobody told them about it, nobody told them what the problem was.
So they assumed the worst.
What the results of that were, and it was never really addressed, and then we got a complaint, and then now you're dealing with an OSHA person because the employees are mad. The best way to get an OSHA inspection is to not share information with your folks.
And it's really vital that you share that information that you're finding with the work groups. It's the way to do it. So much like the hierarchy of control, the hierarchy of occupational exposure limits, the hierarchy of exposure assessment, the hierarchy of exposure controls, this is the hierarchy of controls that we just talked about. These are the exposure assessments. So if we don't do anything, it's no control. It's nothing, right? As we start doing a little more, our programs are getting better, more effective, more robust. And what we're trying to do is help companies get to the top of this list. We talked about hazard banding, similar exposure grouping, okay? What's the difference, Dave? Dave, what makes this better than this?
Hazard banding does not rely or require monitoring.
Okay, and up here we're doing some actual monitoring
Occupational exposure
of the
monitoring
task.
requires specific monitoring. Now, again, where you have a level where you have something to compare it against is where monitoring comes in really great. Where you don't have anything to compare it against is where hazard banding works well.
Okay, so sampling results. After you get the samples back, it's vital that we use these results to control the hazards that we found. And then in our program, we need to write down what we did, how well it worked, or how well it didn't work, and what we did, continuous, ongoing. Again, it's not a one and done thing. Sample results have to be analyzed and compared to at least the OSHA PELs. Again, do we want to stop there? Is the PELs what we're going to aim at? No. We can do better, and hopefully we're all going to continue to do better. Comparison to the more restrictive levels, like action levels, threshold limit values, the TLVs, or better yet, self-imposed standards. I've dealt with a number of VPP companies who say our standard is 50% of the PEL, or our standard is 50% of the TLV.
With our marine conservation, so it's 85, but for us, it's any area that's over 80.
Any area that's over 80, yeah, which is way better than the code. And it's always the good thing to go to. Okay, documentation. Again, I've beat it up already today. I'm not going to stop. Document, document, document. It is vital. We need to talk about the results. It has to include a description of what we were doing, what controls were in place at the time we did it, how long did we sample, what time of day did we sample, what were our exposure calculations, what was the duration of exposure, what are the routes, what's the frequency of exposure, how many people are exposed. Okay, so we're documenting that down in our sampling results. And then, like Dave just talked about, communicate. You've got to share the sampling results with the folks that were, if they wore the sniffer, if they wore the badge or wore the button, you need to go back and close that loop with them and let them know this is what we found.
And everyone who does the same thing they do.
Yes, yes. So if you sampled one guy out of 5 people who do the same job, you share it with all 5 of the people that are doing the same job. Okay? And then use of those results. The sampling results have to be used to identify those areas where we want to do additional or more in-depth study to determine our hazard controls, or like she was saying, where you guys actually used the results, had another industrial hygienist come in and verify, and again, that ongoing control. Never satisfied with where you're at. This triangle talks about how we really need to have a lot of data, acquire the data, get the data documented, start looking at how good that data is, and doing a lot of statistical analysis, and then what are we inferring that before we come to a conclusion. Conclusion has to be based on a lot of good data and study of that data and what that data tells us before we get to a conclusion. This is on page 17 of your handouts. This is another tool that you might consider using, this or something like this, that enables you to determine, okay, what are the tasks, what are the risks, what are the hazards that are exposed, what are the controls, and then we can actually come out with a hazard ranking, and we can color code that thing so that we know, okay, we're going to work on the dark red stuff first, the bright red stuff second, the yellow, and we don't really have to worry so much about the green. So it's just a way of doing this, okay? And again, it's on page 17 of your handouts. And we talk about the importance of industrial hygiene expertise. Having somebody like Dave that I can call and say, hey, Dave, what's your thoughts on this? Having somebody at the corporate level, or having somebody that you know of, that you've worked with before, industrial hygienists, Russ, Jeff, all of these folks that we've worked with. Like I said, I'm going to do it one more time. 503-947-7457. And this gentleman's going to pick up the phone if he's not already talking to somebody. And if you've got an industrial hygiene related question, he's going to be able to answer, I'm going to say probably in my experience, 75% of them off the top of his head. If those ones that he can't, and it gets hard to stump him, but he will research it and get back to you. And that's what Dave does for a living. That's his job. He helps compliance officers. He helps consultants. If we have questions, we call Dave. If you have questions, Dave works for you too. Okay? So he is an industrial hygienist that you have access to. And if this is getting recorded, I just put your name out to the world. So having that access, someplace that's a good resource, okay, the back row can go, is going to help you and enable things to work better for you, okay? Now, that doesn't mean you have to have the certified industrial hygienist do your sampling for you. You can do a lot of this yourself, right? Dave?
Anybody can do this. I'm proof of that. It does not take a special skill to calibrate a pump. What it does take is that you understand
Some training.
what you're looking at, how you're going to measure it, make sure you have all the right stuff.
How to use the tool.
Sometimes even we screw up, we show up with the, we'll do a whole day of sampling, send it to the lab, and the lab will say, well, you used the wrong filter. Okay, so we have to go and do it again.
Okay.
It happens.
Methods, we're going to stick with standard, nationally recognized procedures. They have to be used for sampling, for surveying, as well as for testing and training analysis. Why is it important that we use nationally recognized procedures? For consistency. So we're getting the same kinds of results over and over again. Now, you can also use contractors. You can bring in an outside IH company to do some IH work for you. Nothing wrong with that. It's actually a good idea. Just be sure to let them know what you want them to do, because they won't always do what it is you wanted them to do. We've seen cases where they came in and sampled something that was entirely different from what the company needed sampling. Okay? So make sure you tell them what you need them to do. Any recommendations in their report then is considered and implemented where appropriate. Like Shauna says, she keeps their report on record as part of the industrial hygiene program, as part of the history. Okay? Contractors does not remove the responsibility of the company for the industrial hygiene program. Okay? This slide kind of goes back to reiterate that plan, do, check, act model, that ongoing continuous cycle. Anticipate, evaluate, confirm, reevaluate. You know, what does our hazard look like in the anticipation? We're doing our assessment. We're identifying and defining. We're coming up with, and we're doing our exposure assessment and manage it, control it, and it just continues in that
Once you can permanently eliminate all exposures, it never ends.
It never ends. Okay? So your program again is going to cover the actual and potential industrial hygiene hazards in your workplace. It's going to include guidance on evaluations and IH exposure assessment strategy. Consider developing a spreadsheet or a matrix like some of those that we've shared with you that documents the potential exposures. That spreadsheet really needs to talk about where it was, what are the hazards, describing the hazards, what's the activity that was being done during the hazard evaluation, what were the results, what are the potential health effects, frequency of exposure, hazard controls, and a priority rating for future. How often do we want to come back and reassess this and verify that our numbers are still close to the same? Okay, and finally, we don't want to forget, the rule says that we have to maintain this stuff for 30 years following the end of employment, right? That's a long.
Actually, this is, just 30 years from the time that you take it.
Right. And maintaining them in an orderly manner is going to help you. And your IH program can help you maintain that stuff in an orderly manner. Okay? So, some other things to think about. There's a bunch of these things have substance-specific rules. The ones in blue have initial and periodic monitoring requirements built right into that standard. But all of these things are things that if you have them in your workplace, be thinking about them. Okay, be thinking about including them maybe in your program. So the rest of this stuff is the specific hazards. So we're going to kind of blast through it. If there's something that you want to talk about, shout, we'll stop, we'll talk about it.
Silica, there's a new rule that kicks in on July 1st of this year. And I can tell you from these pictures, this top picture, this guy who's sawing, or looks like he's sawing or writing, and this saw down here, these guys are all both exposed, overexposed.
This guy was actually overexposed and they used a wet method but
So yeah, I'm just, I see a cloud of dust.
Yep.
They're messing with silica.
If you see dust, there's too much.
I do not have to monitor to know that they're gonna be overexposed.
Right, right. Combustible dust. Anybody have combustible dust in the workplace? Okay. Lead. How about, anybody got lead to worry about? We do talk a little bit about lead. There is a site-specific lead rule.
There is a substance, so some of these rules have specific rules about that substance. Lead is one.
How often you've got a sample for it and all that fun
Our
stuff.
exposure, we sell and service forklifts.
Okay?
Okay, and they've gone from propane to electric. Electric is
Batteries.
battery,
Yep,
correct?
yep.
And so we service those batteries.
Right.
That's our exposure. We
So-
solder,
Right,
we have all
right.
sorts of exposures.
So you can do a little bit of monitoring and find out where you're at, whether do we need to do more or less, or maybe develop a control and move on from there. How about asbestos? Anybody got asbestos to worry about anymore? Okay, noise. Yeah, everybody's got noise to deal with. So,
Hey, couple funny things about noise. That's like, I gotta do my soapbox. So, you do your training for your employees, right? They wear their earplugs. Do they wear their earplugs when they're not exposed to noise at work, if they're exposed to noise anywhere else? Like, they go home and mow the lawn? Why not?
We asked them to.
So, yeah, so here's the thing to share with your folks. We know about age-related hearing loss, right? We just naturally lose our hearing as we get older.
right.
Actually, we do not. As a species, we do not naturally lose our hearing as we get older. When we lose our hearing as we get older, those are the wages of living in an industrialized society, from all the sounds and the noises that
The
surround us.
exposures we've had over the
You've
years.
ever been to a concert? How do you know you went to a great concert? Your hands are raw, and your head is full of stuff
Ringing.
with cotton, right? And you can't talk. You go to bed, you go to bed, you wake up, and your hearing is right back where it was, right?
Almost.
After the ringing stuff.
It's not.
Yeah.
It is not. You have lost some.
And it's not coming
But you
back.
don't have anything to compare it against, so you don't notice it until it's too late.
Right.
And the hearing that you have today is the best it's going to be for the rest of your life.
It's only going to get worse. Okay, vibration. Yeah, wasn't that a downer? How many of us have a lot of vibration going on?
Like personally,
There's a lot of equipment out there, a lot of vibration resistant tools. One of the questions came up one of the other times we give this class was, okay, I've got an employee who has to stand on a work platform that's vibrating pretty good. They make all kinds of cushioning stuff that you can put underneath there to take out some of that vibration. Hexchrome.
Question.
Yes.
Is there a device for measuring vibration on equipment?
yes.
There's 3 of them.
I was looking at that. I've never seen them before. Can you take a moment and just,
I hope my IH can.
You know what? I've actually never used one.
okay.
So it's one of the toys I've never gotten to play with.
Now, what I've seen them do is they will use it in a preventive maintenance type mode, where you've got a gear head or what, and they'll measure that for vibration to see how close it's getting to wearing out. But they do have vibration tools that you
can test for
you can
vibration.
test to see how much vibration. You'll know if there's vibration or not.
Yeah.
And
We're
this.
we're having some strains and sprains and some, mainly a carpal tunnel
Right.
into here.
Because
And that's-
vibration is much like sound,
It's sound,
in
right.
that
It's energy.
It's energy waves.
Right. And I do the testing for the noise, but I haven't seen anything for vibration because I want to start moving in that direction to look on pieces
Okay.
of equipment that are causing some issues, I think.
Yeah. Hexchrome. It's one of the substance-specific rules. You've got to monitor how often.
Well, that depends on your exposure level,
Okay.
what the exposure was. So if you do initial monitoring, you find nothing, you're done,
Right.
unless there's a change. If you do initial monitoring and you find that they're over the action level, then you're doing it every 6 months.
Right.
If you find that they're over the permissible limit, you're doing it every 3 months.
And that's the code specifically says. Okay. Cadmium. Anybody dealing with cadmium? Okay. And benzene. Probably not a lot. It is still out there. Formaldehyde. Glues. Wood products industry uses a lot of glues that have formaldehyde. Some of it says that it's not in the product until the product is heated and then it off gases. Right?
They'll say that they're wrong.
Okay. Methylene chloride. This is the bathroom stripper that people will use on refinishing bathroom tubs, and there have been entirely too many people have died face down in a bathtub by cleaning that stuff because it's heavier than air. It stays in there. If they don't have good forced ventilation, they get their face down into that stuff as they're scrubbing. They don't come back up again. We've had a number of fatalities from that. Spray booths. Anybody want to talk about spray booths? Okay, chlorine. You guys are making this easy. Manganese.
Actually, chlorine, don't mix it with ammonia.
It's part of our steel product mixed into the steel.
Manganese, you're seeing a lot of it as an additive. Yeah.
We have it on our SDS, but in our production and what we do, we work with a mill scale.
Right.
Which, you know, is the chippings off which we get tons of.
Right.
And we
So
process
it's really important to be aware of these things that it does. If you start seeing your people exhibiting compulsive behaviors or mood swings, it might be something to look into. You know, impaired intelligence, it's been shown that it'll reduce IQ in children. It's not good things for developing young minds. Chemical reaction. How many of you are mixing chemicals to make things or to do things? We want
Little Daffy Duck cartoon where he has the devil suit on and he's like, and then it blows up. That happens every time you mix chemicals, right?
to some degree. Okay, flammability, explosives. Use a little bit of those in certain jobs. Know their flash points. Again, the SDS is going to tell you a lot of good stuff in that. Ergonomics is something that is out there that everybody's exposed to. An ergonomist or an IH can help you assess ergo hazards. They can help you develop controls, provide training, education, help you set up your medical management processes, and help you actually develop your ergonomic program. In your handouts, I'm going to want to guess it's 37 and 38. We'll see if I'm that good of a guesser.
We have an issue with the ergonomics, and what we've done is actually hired a physical therapist, ergonomist,
Okay.
to consult to come out and develop a program for us.
I was wrong. It's 36 and 35. There is ergonomic worksheet that you can feel free to R&D, right? Biohazards.
Bloodborne pathogens, other potentially
Thank
infectious
you.
materials.
Thank you. And if you have these exposures, you're required to have a written exposure control plan. Okay, where you have some of these IH-related hazards that are covered by another written plan, just be sure to reference the IH plan to that plan and that plan to the IH plan so that you're connecting those things. Okay. Heat stress, something we're seeing more and more and more. We're actually last summer, the compliance officers were asked to address what are employers doing about heat stress in jobs where there's exposure to heat stress.
So there is a new program directive, came out last spring. It is available on our website. It also gives you an idea of what it is we're going to be looking for.
Okay,
So particularly those from southern regions.
And for those of you who are VPP sites and SHARP sites, it's something that the consultants and the VPP teams are going to be evaluating is how you're dealing with this. And so that program directive that's on the webpage might be a good thing to download and kind of pay attention to. Okay? ICE. We do have it. Some industries more than others. We don't have it quite like they do, say, on the North Slope, but we still have, and we need to be aware of that stuff. Okay? Workplace violence, while it's not an industrial hygiene program, it is a very big issue these days and moving forward, and we wanted to include it in here. Be sure that you're thinking about that. If you want to reference your violence program back to your IH program and back and forth, that's a good thing.
Another one thing you can do for the violence is a lot of local police departments will do threat assessments.
Yes.
So if you call them, they'll come out and actually do a hazard threat assessment for workplace violence issues, and help you identify things you can do to make life a little bit better.
Okay. Some other programs to think about that we really didn't get into today, but if you have some of these things, again, feel free to include them in your written industrial hygiene, safety, and health program.
Oh wait, go back one. Go back one.
Yeah.
Anyone who can say that gets to go to the front of the room.
What's the acronym of low confined space?
DBCP, dibromochloropropane.
Oh, okay.
And it was in the ag industry in California. They used it, and it goes down into the water and doesn't come out. It comes back up when you try to drink it. And really bad stuff. It's pretty much been outlawed. But yeah, thanks for saying what that was.
I haven't seen that before, so I just wanted to see.
Okay.
Yeah, you're not gonna. I don't think I've seen it.
Yeah. I think they outlawed it quite a while back. So at the end of the day, in closing, the employer has to understand what are the hazards your employees are exposed to and what are the levels of those exposures. Okay? Your written industrial hygiene program can help you do this. Okay? The employer needs to be able to use negative exposure to show that the potential exposures are either not there or they are there at such a level, they're so well controlled that they're not something to worry about. Okay? And that's what your written industrial hygiene program can help you do. Okay? Any questions? Any comments?
Threw a bunch of stuff at you in a real short amount of time.
Buried you with stuff. I do want to touch bases on what all is in your handouts. So the first 14 pages were copies of the PowerPoint slides. There may have been a couple that weren't there, but they were kind of, you didn't need them. On page 15 is that sample product hazard assessment that we talked about early on. On page 16 is a sample health hazard matrix. Okay? Page 17 is the sample incident action plan safety analysis. Pages 18 through 20 are samples of a SEG similar exposure group. Okay? Pages 21 to 23 is a risk assessment and risk monitoring guidance. And then on page 24 is a sample of a exposure risk assessment that was done following that guidance. Okay? Page 30 is a sample of a noise map. Page 31 to 32 is an IH audit needs assessment that one of our consultants shared with us. So it's a tool that they use every time they go out and do an industrial hygiene consultation. Page 33 is a sample programs needs assessment form. Page 34 is that IH self-assessment questions for VPP. And I would strongly urge you to look at that, and if you can answer the questions on there, your program and your knowledge of your program is probably in pretty good shape. If there are questions on there that leave you scratching your head, you got some work you can do. Okay? Page 35 to 36 is the ergonomic risk factors checklist that we talked about. Page 37 to 40 is the sample outline for a written IH program. This was developed by a number of our consultants. Dave had a heavy hand in that about 8 years ago, 10 years ago.
I got better.
And then the last sample is on pages 41 to 46 is a sample risk assessment strategy or a sample policy that is almost a fill-in-the-blank IH program that you can use going forward. Okay? Any questions? Any comments?
Well, this material, I mean, we have a good safety program on any given day, a snapshot on the old grade system, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe a B. But this program, this material, this presentation really helps us move this thing up.
That's the whole idea behind it.
Very good.
Yeah. Okay? I would like to thank Shelley and the Tillamook team for hosting this. Thank you very much. And Dave for coming to my rescue. Thanks a lot.